Let's learn now how to put everything together in a cohesive way, create a track that is interesting and keeps the beat moving. So we learned a few elements in previous videos. We learned how to layer a beat using two different kits and then adding an extra layered kick drum in order to give a punchier type of groove. And just to review how that sounds, it sounds like this. So this is my basic drum beat. And then we also learn how to add a sub bass in order to give a nice low end that doesn't cover the kick. And to do that, we learn how to sidechain, compress the bass to the kick drum. And then we added our wavetable arpeggiator patch that gives us the harmonic motion. At this point we have all the basic elements. So now it's just a question of making the track a little bit more interesting by adding a few more elements. So let's take a look at these other elements. If we go from the beginning of the piece, I have this bass part, which it's a stack of a couple of different basses that were created also with my trustworthy wavetable synthesizer. And in this case I use two interesting samples. I use a Juno sample that was sampled from an analog synthesizer that I have in my studio, and a voice sample. Let's listen to these two samples before I imported them into codecs. I have a voice sample. More cowbell, please. Which is a kind of like a funny and pretty interesting sample to use. And then I have a more traditional Juno sample. And by combining these two together, what I created was a bass patch that sounds like this. And as you can see, I used actually more of the voice sample. I added a sub note in order to give a deeper end and also to make the patch sounding more like a bass. I also have a unison on, which means I'm in monophonic mode, so I play one note at a time, but that gives me a richer type of tone. And I use a few LFOs. As you can see, I have an LFO controlling the oscillator table 1. I have an LFO 3 controlling the scan speed of the first oscillator, and then I have an LFO 2 controlling the scan start of the first oscillator. This is to create something a little bit more changing over time and a little bit more interesting. And of course, I layer two sounds here. There are two different octaves, and so I'm using a stack in Logic to layer the two sounds again to make something a little bit more rich. So let's listen to the bass part by itself. So that creates a nice deep end and a pretty nasty type of bass sound. Of course, that's sweetened a little bit by my subsonic bass. So if I listen to the two together, and I'm gonna also bring in my kick, so I have the pulse being triggered on the subsonic bass. And this gives me a really deep but punchy and rough and nasty type of bass sound, which add character to the piece. So once I added the bass to my beat, the effect sounds like this. Now what I needed is to have a little bit of motion in my harmonic pattern, and as we learned before, I used my arpeggiator to create that, and I decided to have the first part just stay on the minor chord, and that creates sort of like a pedal point in the harmonic motion while the bass moves, and that's the effect. Then after 8 bars like this, I'm gonna bring in my regular harmonic progression that creates a little bit of overall motion in the piece, right? So I start with the pedal tone on the harmonic part, and then I'm gonna move to the regular progression. Let's listen to the effect. I was still missing something, and at this point, once you have everything set up, you have the groove, you have the harmonic motion, you have the bass, it's kind of time just to add some ear candies, some sounds here and there that add something to either the melodic motion, the harmonic motion, or the rhythmic part. So I added this rhythmic synth that sounds like this. And the purpose of this track is to just keep a steady line that moves in between the harmonies. So let's listen to this part with just the bass and my arpeggiated synth. And so at this point, I reach my break. And so I wanted to create a break part where things slow down a little bit in order to pick them back up after the break. So in the break, I change the groove, so the groove gets much less busy. I had the subsonic bass also is less busy. I just stay on one note. And I added another part, a new part in the break, and this was created again with codecs. For this specific part, I started from my usual 2 samples, a Juno and a Yamaha, but I twisted it a little bit, and this is what the part sounds like. what I did is to take a previous patch that I created, but this time I added two things. First, I added some distortion using the pedal board effects in Logic, and basically I added like a spin box, added an octave shifter, and I added just a drive effect and an overdrive, and that adds some kind of nasty type of effect that gives more character to the patch. But also I added a ring shifter in order to create more variation. But what I did was also to automate the filter of codecs. So as you can see here, I have MIDI automation that controls the pass filter of my patch. This creates a nice motion that allows me to build in the break towards again the full ensemble. So that's something that you should use when you want to create the effect of something building up. So with these simple techniques, I built a nice patch that sounds fresh and it's able to evolve over time. And finally, I created a little bit of a build-up in the drums in order to go back to my full instrumentation. And to do so, I simply added a build-up with a snare. Here's my build-up. That's a typical build-up that works very well. Now, going back into the full section, I added one more instrument, which is the hard synth. And again, this is a codecs patch, always built with my Juno and my voice sample 1. Those are two different samples that I used, and the patch sounds like this. And the typical part is built on an arpeggio that is sequenced with this typical groove, where I only turn on certain 16 notes in my 16-note pattern. So now when the full track comes back, sounds like this.